before God. We've been kind of going through some of the Old Testament characters, and some of them more famous than others, and kind of examples of faith for us. And so this morning we're going to look at two, really just one, but the other one kind of gets lumped in there. But as you know, the Supreme Court of the United States is made up of 9 justices, 9 people who have been appointed or nominated by the President and then confirmed by the Senate. And these 9 justices hear between 100 and 150 cases each year. Now, we don't hear about most of them, and the vast majority of them are settled by a unanimous vote of 9-0. But there are some cases that split the court. There are some that they really have to kind of dwindle down. They really kind of have to have this vote on. And the official ruling, the one that's accepted, is the one that the majority of those 9 agree with. And so it's interesting to me that you can have 9 people sitting in the same room, listening to the same argument, hearing and seeing the same facts laid out in front of them, and even having the same book of law in front of them that they're supposed to be working from, and yet they come to a point of decision, and these same 9 people who have had all the same stuff throughout the whole thing can come to a decision-making where they come to a conclusion that is the polar opposite of each other. And sometimes they do that 5-4, sometimes they do that to 6-3, and sometimes they do it even 7-2. But it's interesting to me how they can have all this stuff the same, and yet they come to this place where they come to a conclusion that is completely different from each other. And they have to make that decision. And so when they do that, they have what they call the majority report or the official opinion, and they sometimes have these dissenting opinions. The judge who is not on the winning side will feel so strongly about this case that he wants to write in his opinion. He wants to write in what he thinks of why this is the wrong conclusion. And as we get to Numbers chapter 13 and part of 14 this morning, I kind of feel like this same thing is happening. That there's this majority of people who have given their conclusion, but there's 1 or 2 who are willing to stand alone and kind of give a dissenting opinion. You see, by the time we reach Numbers 13 and 14, the people of Israel, they've come out of slavery of Egypt. They made their way across the Red Sea. They've wandered through the desert for a little while, and they've come almost to the edge of the promised land. They've come to the point where they've got to make a decision whether we are going into this place or not. And so rather than just rush right in kind of blindly, they send some spies in. They send 12 spies in to figure out what this place is going to be like, to see what the people are going to be like. And so these 12 men, they all saw the same thing. These 12 men all experienced the same thing. And yet they come back just kind of like the Supreme Court. They have these 2 totally different kind of polar opposite reports to give. And there are 10 on one side and 2 on the other. And so these 10 give their report, and this morning we're going to look at kind of focus on the 2, really one guy who is willing to stand up, and he's willing to stand alone if he has to do it by himself. Regardless of what these other 10 say, this is where I'm going to stand, and this is where I'm going to be. And so Caleb and Joshua are these 2 great examples of even though something seems impossible, you stand on what God has said, even if you are standing alone. Kind of like that song says, that when we're in God's love, we can stand regardless. And so Caleb and Joshua kind of give us this courage to see what it's like to stand alone. What does it take to stand alone for God? And how do we do that for ourselves? And so if you've got your Bibles, we're going to read, it's kind of a lengthy passage this morning. We're going to start in Numbers 13. Starting in verse 26, and we're going to actually read all the way through verse 14, the first 10 verses, right? So, Numbers chapter 13, verse 26 says, "The men went back to Moses and Aaron and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh, and they brought back a report from them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. And they reported to Moses, 'We went in to the land and where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anakim there, and the Amalekites are living in the land of Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan.'" In verse 30, "Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, 'We must go up and take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer it.' But the men who had gone up with him reported, 'We cannot go up against the people because they are stronger than we are.' So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nymphi there, and the descendants of Anakim came from the Nymphin. To ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seen the same to them. Chapter 14, verse 1 says, Then the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, If only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land to die by the sword? Our wives and our little children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better if we go back to Egypt? So they said to one another, Let's appoint a leader and go back to Egypt. Verse 5, Then Moses and Aaron fell down with their face to the ground in front of the whole assembly of the Israelite community. Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh were also among those who scouted out the land, tore their clothes, and they said to the entire Israelite community, The land we passed through and explored is an extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. And the whole community threatened to stone them, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tent of meeting. Let's pray this morning. Father, we thank you so much for today. God, we thank you that we have this opportunity to stand in your love. And God, that we stand in your love, God, that we can do just that we can stand regardless of what else is going on around us, regardless of what we are facing, regardless of what is forced on us, God, that we can stand in full confidence that you love us, God. That we can stand in full confidence that you are true to every promise that you have ever made to us and have ever made through the history of this world. And so, God, I pray this morning that you speak to us. God, I pray this morning that you reveal to us, God, if we are standing at a crossroads, the decision that needs to be made, whether we go with what the majority says, or even though there is one lone voice, God, that we be the one who's willing to stand on the truth. And so, God, I pray this morning that you speak to our hearts. God, I pray that you speak through this text. And God, I pray that you give us eyes to see, not just in this text, but into this world that we're living in, the truth that we need to stand on, Father. And so, God, I pray that we have courage to do what Caleb does. God, to stand, to make known the truth. And even if we are standing alone, God, let us stand boldly for you, Father. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. As we read through the text, you probably noticed this difference between the 10 versus the 2. And so this difference between what we call the majority report and the minority report. And I've kind of broken our passage up a little bit that way just because to me it was easier. And it kind of flip-flops back and forth between the two. So we're going to work through these two reports this morning because there are some great lessons for all of us in both of these, the majority report and the minority report. You see, the majority report, this is the popular opinion. This is the one that folks are kind of drawn to because this is what most people are saying. And I think we need to hear this report, even though this is honestly the report of the unfaithful. This is the report of the uncommitted. This is the report of the people who lack trust in the promise of God. And sadly enough, we need to pay attention to it because you don't have to look very far to find the same characteristics that are in this report in other parts of our society today. In fact, you pick up a newspaper today and you read an article, I don't care what article it is, you're probably going to find some of these characteristics in it. You're going to find some of these characteristics in people that you know and some of these characteristics in friends that you have. And you're definitely going to find it in the political realm. You're going to find these characteristics. These are what people are playing on to get you to go and follow their popular opinion. You see, the first thing the majority report does is that it overlooks the good, but it exaggerates the bad. And if you're following along with the outline, I've kind of changed it up a little bit. That's actually kind of a combination of the first 2 points. We'll work through them together. But in verse 27, I want you to notice they start to mention how good the land is, okay? Just slightly. They're going to give it a nod, but just slightly. In verse 27, the 10 men report back to Moses, and they went into the land that you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here is some of its fruits. This phrase, flowing with milk and honey, goes back to the very beginning of the people of Israel and very beginning of them coming out of slavery. In fact, if you go back all the way back to the first time that God calls Moses to be his leader, and the leader of these people, it's back in Exodus chapter 3 when he calls him through the burning bush, and we kind of have this amazing experience. And this is the promise that God says in Exodus chapter 3, verse 8. He says, I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them to a land, get this, that is good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The territory of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. You see, this is the promise that God had given them. This is the land is going to be good. The land is going to be in abundance. The land is going to supply more to you than you could ever imagine. This land is going to go even further than that. I want you to think about not just supplying what you need, but it's going to have such an abundance. I have had very little experience milking a cow. Okay, I'm just going to be honest with you. I have done it, but I don't do it very often. All right, maybe because in Beaumont Farms it's just in the name. We don't really have a farm there. Okay. But I can tell you I have even less experience robbing honey from bees. And I know I've got some folks here, you've got lots of experience in that, right? Now I want you to imagine either one of those is not an easy task. Some of you have had experience with both, some of you have had experience with neither one, and I understand that. But I want to share with you that neither one of those are an easy task. You got to convince an animal that weighs several hundred pounds to stand still and let you milk it. And then for a bee, you've got to convince them that you're the good guy and what you're doing is actually for their good, even though they think what you're doing is for their bad. And so you put on this full suit and cover up everything, and you go in there and you steal their honey from them. It's not easy. Now, I want you to imagine for you guys that do that, take it back several hundred years before bee suits and all the smoke stuff was around. And then you had to walk in there naked, and not really naked, but just with your regular clothes, and you had to rob the bees that way. That's difficult. Now, understand what God is saying. I'm going to take you into a land that's so abundant with milk and honey that it's so easy for you to get the milk and honey that you need. You don't have to work for it like you're doing now. You don't have to struggle like you are now. It's so easy that it's as easy as if you walk to the river and you got water out of the stream. That's how simple this is going to be for you. That's how much an abundance of honey and milk there's going to be. In fact, there's going to be so much honey everywhere. The bees, they're not even going to care if you steal their honey from them. The milk is going to be so much there. There's going to be so much milk that these cows are going to come to you and say, hey, please milk me. Get rid of this. Help me out here. And they're going to come to you. And so understand that what he's promising him, man, is this is going to be such an abundance in this land. Life is going to be so much easier than you ever known. It's going to be so much easier. It's going to be like getting water from a stream for you. And so sure enough, when the spies get into the land, what do they see? Just that. They see this land that is just what God's promised, this land of abundance, this land of plenty, this land that is flowing with milk and honey, and they see that it is good. And in fact, they bring back some of the fruit, and they want to show it to the people of how good it is. In fact, we didn't read it, but if you look back a couple verses in verse 23, it talks about how they brought back a cluster of grapes that was so big, they had to put it on a pole, and it had to be carried between two men. That's how big this cluster of grapes was. This was the fruit they brought back to the people. This was what they were bringing back to show them how wonderful this land was going to be. But I want you to notice how quickly they turned their attention from what is good to what is wrong with it. You see, they spend one small verse talking about how good the land is and how great it is and how wonderful the land is. But quickly in verse 28, they shift their focus to the bad. In verse 28, it starts with however. You could substitute that word for despite. So the land is good, but despite that, here's the bad. Despite all this good stuff, here's the bad. Despite the good-looking fruit, despite the fact that God was true and everything that He told us, despite the fact that He's promised us, despite all that, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. And we saw descendants of Anak there. And I don't know if you've ever bought a home or you've recently bought a home, and we are long past shopping for homes, and I hope we never have to do it again. But when you look for houses, you kind of look at tons of them, and then you find that one. And that one is the one you're excited about. And everything about it is either right or so close that you can taste it that is right. The layout is right. The colors of it are right. Everything, this becomes the house that you really, really want. And so you start to build this excitement about it. And so you start to kind of build up this energy about it. And so this is the one you put the bid in and you win the bid. And man, you are feeling so energetic. This is the dream house. This is the perfect house. This is going to do exactly what you need for your family. And then you do this crazy thing. In the midst of the buying process, you go hire a home inspector. You know what the home inspector's job to do is? Come in and point out everything that's wrong with that house. Now, there's a legitimate reason you do that, okay? So I'm not saying don't do that. If you're buying a house, you need to do that. But you go in and you hire this guy who, he doesn't care the layout of the house. He doesn't care that it's a perfect color that's going to match the curtains. He doesn't care about any of that. His one job is to point out all the things that are wrong with this house. And I remember we have bought several houses and we've looked at several houses and we've gotten to this point where we get this list and we're like, oh. And so it doesn't matter how great you felt about the house before that. It didn't matter how excited you were. As soon as you get that report, and sometimes we've had reports that are like 1 page. We're like, oh, that's not too bad. And then we've had reports that are like 12 pages. And you're just like, oh, maybe this isn't as perfect as I thought it was. And so there's this kind of Debbie Downer moment for you. And this is exactly kind of how I think the people are feeling, like there is this excitement about this land. And then all of a sudden, despite all this good that we're telling you about, let me give you this list of bad. The people there are big. They have large cities and they are well fortified, which means these people are going to be impossible for us to beat. You see, not only do they tell you the bad, but man, they really exaggerate how bad it is. If you go on and look in verse 29, we'll see their first exaggeration. They start listing this group of people in the land. We're not going to read back over that list, but they start listing this group of people, which we should expect. God's already told us this is the land of these people, the Canaanites, the Hittites, all that list of group of people. We shouldn't expect that. So that's not an exaggeration. They know they're there. The exaggeration comes when you start to map out where they say they're at, right? So we're not going to do this, but if you had time, you could go in and you could say, look at this. They're going to say, this group is here, this group's here, this group is here, and this group is here and here. So basically, if you covered the whole area, that's where everybody's at. So what they're really doing is saying, hey, listen, the land's good, but it's full. There's a no vacancy sign anywhere on this. There's no free spot. There's no empty spot. This land is covered with all these other groups. And so when you get in the land, if you decide to go in this land, you need to understand that you're going to have to fight these groups all the time. There's not like a little empty pasture over here that you can just take over and nobody's going to be there. You're going to have to fight for every inch that you get. And then when you get in there, they're still all around you. Once you get in, you're surrounded by all these people that are going to be kind of coming after you all the time. So understand this idea. You're going to have to fight these groups all the time. But if you really look at the truth, they weren't fully covering the land. Yeah, there was a group here and a group here and a group here and a group here, but there's this big section kind of right in the middle that was totally empty at this time. They just had to get through the first kind of layers, but their exaggerations get worse. If you look down at verse 32 and verse 33, verse 32 says, the land we pass through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants. This land is going to eat us alive. The land itself is not going to be friendly to us. Not to mention the people, the land is going to be bad. Now, this should raise a question for us. Because how can you tell me just a few verses ago that there are tons of people, this whole place is full of people, and yet in the very next verse tell me, by the way, it devours its people. If a land devours its people, it shouldn't be full. If a land devours its people, you shouldn't have a problem finding empty space because nobody wants to live there. In fact, nobody can live there. So their exaggeration is this land is bad. This land is not good. And then we go on in verse 33, this other exaggeration. In verse 33, it says, the end of verse 32, it says, and all, I want you to notice that word there, we'll come back to it in a minute, and all the people we saw in the land were men of giant size. These people were big. They were huge. In verse 33, it was so much that we seemed like grasshoppers to them. Like when we looked at them, we thought we were the size of a grasshopper. Now, I want you to picture this in your mind. Picture a big old grasshopper, the biggest grasshopper that you've ever seen. Now put it beside you and see the size comparison to it. So in your mind, think about that for just a second. That's a huge difference between a grasshopper. And I don't know how grasshoppers actually get, probably that, maybe with their legs, maybe this big. I'm not very tall, but even to me, that's not very big. So this is the exaggeration. This is so bad. We're like grasshopper. We're like this big compared to how tall they are. This is an exaggeration to kind of instill fear in the people that they are sharing with. But I want you to see that we go back to verse 32 in this exaggeration. This one small word makes this huge difference. And he says that all the people we saw were men of great size. Now, I'm not doubting that when they got in the land, they saw some giants. I'm not doubting by any means that when they got there were some tall, really big people. Because after all, if you read on the story, this is the place where Goliath lives. When King David is fighting Goliath, we know there are giants in this land. We know there are tall people in there. But I want you to understand, the problem is not that there's big people there. My doubt is really, are all the people that size? See, part of the reason Goliath is such an anomaly, such an outstanding warrior, is because he's different than everybody else. And so I'm doubting when you use this word all. All the people are not that size. All the people are not 9 foot, and all the people are not the size of a grasshopper. And so is it going to be difficult? Yes. Is it going to be hard? Yes. Are there some really big guys there? Yes. But are all the people that way? No. It's not. And so there's this exaggeration that they have to exaggerate how bad it's going to be. This exaggeration is simply meant to instill fear because they want you to change your opinion from good to bad. And so we're going to tell you the good because we want to be at least a little honest and walk away with what we think is our integrity. We're going to give you a little bit of good, but then we're going to give you the bad, and we're going to exaggerate how bad it is. And often we do this because we're afraid of it ourselves, or we want to instill fear in someone else. So I want to give you this warning kind of across the board. When you read something that only gives you the bad and never any of the good, maybe you're reading a report that's trying to change your opinion to theirs. Be careful when you read people and you read things that are that way. And this fear and this unbelief becomes highly contagious amongst them, and it becomes highly contagious amongst us. I want you to see that it's 10 people who come back and they tell how bad and how dangerous the land is. And I want you to see how quickly it spreads amongst all the people. If we flip over just to chapter 14, the very first verse of chapter 14 says, the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. And we read on the first part of verse 2, all the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron. At this time, it's estimated there was over 1 million people in the nation of Israel. Over 1 million. It took 10. It went from 10 people who overlooked the good, 10 people who exaggerated the bad, to over 1 million people who are weeping and crying that night. Within the sun setting, within 24 hours, maybe if we even take it down to within 12 hours of the sun, by the time night falls, this bad news has spread beyond measure. This bad news, this exaggeration, this looking down on the good, man, it is so contagious. It is spread all over, and they are questioning God. They're questioning Moses as God's leader, and they're complaining against him. They're dissatisfied with Moses. They're dissatisfied with Aaron. They're protesting the leadership and the direction that they've been leading in. They've neglected the fact that God is the one who's brought them here this whole way. You see, we've still got to remember that they are following the pillar of the cloud. And so when the cloud goes, they glow. And when the cloud stops, they stop. And so I want you to see this warning for all of us really quick. Simply this, that when we speak negative things, when we overlook the good, when we exaggerate the bad about someone or something, you need to know this. That news will travel far. And that news will travel fast. I don't know why, but for some reason the world loves bad news. Maybe it's because we like to look down on people. But I want you to hear this. What we need to understand is that the negative things that we say carries weight, and it can cause lasting damage that we never anticipated. This negative report, these negative words of these 10 men traveled through a whole community, 1 million people, and by the end of the day, this whole community, they've totally lost heart. They have lost their desire to go into the land. This journey that they've been on for years now, they've totally lost that this is the focus. They've lost sight of the fact that God has been making them this promise and promising them over and over. And now they've lost the fact that God's made this promise and God's not going to keep it. And the warning here is clear. That your negative words and your negative attitudes, they spread like a wildfire, and they will desire anything, or they'll devour anything that gets in their path. So I want you to make sure that when you take your focus off the good and you exaggerate the bad, that's going to spread faster and further than anything else. And it's going to turn a wavering heart completely away from Him, because that's exactly what happens with these people. 10 people come back and they spread to 1 million people. And all of a sudden they look and they're like, maybe we can't trust this God anymore. maybe we should just go back. You see, and all of a sudden, these people who are wavering in their hearts decide they'd rather turn back to a terrible familiarity than go on to a glorious unknown. So if we look back in verse 2, it says the Israelites started complaining about Moses and Aaron, and they say, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. If only we had died in the wilderness. And going on to verse 3, why is the Lord bringing us to the land to die by the sword? Isn't that an interesting thing? I'd rather have died there. I'd rather have died over there. Why is God bringing us here to die? You ever think about it? You're dead either way. What difference does it make where you die at? And we'd rather die in Egypt. We'd rather die in this wilderness. And God's brought us here to die, and we're going to have to fight. And make it worse that our wives and our little children will become plunders. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And I'm convinced that they're looking at their past in these rose-colored glasses to the point that they think life would be better if they just went back to Egypt. Do you remember what life was like in Egypt? Your wife and your children, they were plunder. They were slaves, and so were you. And so maybe they have forgotten how bad things were in Egypt, but something tells me when you were a slave and you've been made free, you don't forget what it was like to be a slave. My guess is that when you've been beaten and your body has the scars to prove the beatings that you've survived through, that those didn't wash away when you walked across the Red Sea. My guess is they didn't forget. They just want to go back to something that's familiar. Hey, we don't know what's over there, but at least we know what's going on over here. And so oddly enough, there's something comfortable about familiar, and even odd enough that it's even if we know what to expect is something bad and painful, at least we know what to expect. And for some of us, there's some level of comfort in knowing what to expect. And you see, the truth is that it takes zero faith to go backwards to something that's familiar. It takes zero faith to go back to, even though it's bad, we know what's coming. It takes a ton of faith to do the opposite, to move forward into an unknown area. And you're like, well, Michael, they knew the area, and you're right. They knew the area. The problem was they didn't know how to get there. And not that they didn't know the direction, they just didn't know the steps of how they were going to conquer it. You see, that they knew the land was great. They just didn't know how they were going to take control of the land. You see, they knew the end results. They just didn't see the steps of how to get there. And I wonder how many of us, we see this glorious end game. We know the promise that God has made for us in life and maybe in each individual situation. We know that. But we turn our backs on that because we don't see all the steps leading up to it. I wonder how many of us have lost faith and trust in God because He didn't show us each and every step of the way all at one time. I wonder how many of us have turned our back on a glorious future, a glorious promise of God because He only showed us one step in front of the other instead of all 10 or 20 at the one time. I wonder how many of us have turned our backs on God and how many of us are willing to go back and settle for a terrible, familiar situation instead of pressing on to the glorious unknown because we didn't know what to expect, because we didn't know every single step in the process. Would it make a difference to these folks if they knew that God was already clearing out the way? Would it make a difference to these folks if they knew that God was already clearing some of the people out? The reason the land was devouring the people was because God had sent bees and swarms into the land to wipe some of them out. Would it make a difference if God had showed them those steps? But He doesn't at this point. And so they're willing to turn their back on something glorious, something they know is great, the full promise of God, because they don't see what God is doing in the meantime. And I wonder how often we do the same thing. We don't see what God is doing from here to there, and so we just give up on the there and we go backwards. It takes zero faith to go back to comfort and familiar, but it takes a ton of faith to press on to the unknown when you don't know the next step. You just know that there's a glorious future waiting for you. We started this morning talking about the Supreme Court and how one or more justices are willing to write these dissenting opinions, and they write them for several reasons, and some of them will tell you why they write them, but very rarely do they ever write them for the purpose of changing the mind of the other judges. In fact, by that point, they know they're not going to do that. Right? They know that even if the case was decided 8-1 or 7-2, that regardless of how good their dissenting opinion is, at that point it's not going to change the minds of the majority. So that's not really the reason they write it. Most of them would tell you they write it for a future case, or they write it to change the minds of the people who are in charge. For example, one of the ladies who wrote, a Supreme Court justice who wrote a dissenting opinion, she wrote it to change Congress's mind, to challenge Congress to change the law. You see, there was this court case that came to the Supreme Court, and because the way the law was written, they had to decide it a certain way. Even though they didn't really agree with it, even though they didn't think it was fair, they decided it this way because this was the way the law was written. And so there was one justice who dissented in her opinion, and she voted against it. And in her dissenting opinion, she wasn't trying to change the minds of the other judges. She knew that wasn't going to happen. What she was doing is she wrote her dissent to Congress to tell them to change the wording of the law so that this situation doesn't happen again. And believe it or not, within 2 years, Congress acted and they changed the wording of the law so that the next time that situation happened, it was more fair for everybody involved. And so that's what's happening with Caleb. When Caleb comes to this crowd, he's not going to give his opinion in Numbers 13, verse 30. He's not going to give his opinion to change the mind of the 10. He already knows. They've made up their mind. He's going to try to win over Moses. He's going to try to win over really the people of Israel that God had promised this land to. And so in Numbers chapter 13, verse 30, I in my mind picture this real dramatic moment here. The 10 have given their report. They've told how it was good, but it was all this bad stuff, and how there were these giants there. And then there's all this murmur and all this talking as it spreads amongst the crowd. And then we get to verse 30. And in verse 30, then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses. And he says this, we must go up and take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer. Do you hear the confidence in his voice? We must. He doesn't say we should. He doesn't say I think we can. He doesn't say I think it's an idea we should consider down the road. He says we must. Why? Because this is what God has called us to do. Because this is what God has promised us. We must do it. Is it going to be easy? No. Do we have a clear battle plan? No. But the only thing I know is this is what God's called us to do, and there's no question about it. When God says it, we do it. We must go about it. Now, I want you to understand that when Caleb is doing this, he's standing on the commands and the promises of God at this point. He's willing to stand up for what he believes, even though if he's the only one doing it. 10 other spies have told the bad news. And Caleb stands in front of this crowd. I want you to notice he stands up in front of this crowd. He gets the whole crowd's attention. He didn't call Moses off to the side. Hey, Moses, let me talk to you quietly. Here's my opinion on this. He didn't listen to the report of the 10 and just shy back and be like, well, it doesn't really make a difference now. This is what's going to happen. In the face of all that, he gets in front of the crowd, he quiets the whole crowd, and he says, listen, we must go. We must do this. And very simply what he's doing is this is what God has called us to do. And he doesn't care if the other 10 doesn't believe him. He doesn't care if other people disagree with him. He's going to stand boldly and confidently in their face, and he's going to state his beliefs. And it's because he believes that this is what God's called him to do, to stand, to be bold, to move forward with the promise that God has given him and all these people. And for him, this is the only option he has. There's not an option of turning back when you're following the will of God. There's not an option of turning back when you're doing what God's called you to do. And so Caleb is willing to stand, even if he has to stand alone, because he's fully trusting in God's promises. And people, he's addressing these people who have taken their eyes off of God's faithfulness, and he tries to redirect them back to that. You see, that's the other beauty part. That's the great thing that allows us to stand in the confidence of God, even when we're alone, is that we see the faithfulness of God in each and every situation. And so Caleb tries to appeal to this. Back in verse 7 of chapter 14, he addresses the entire crowd again. He says, the land we passed through and explored, get this, it is an extremely good land. Did you hear the report of the other guys? It's all right. It's good. But Caleb said, it is extremely good. Beyond your imagination good. In verse 8, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into the land, and the land flowing with milk and honey, and give it to us. And Caleb tries to bring their attention back to the faithfulness of God. He tries to bring their attention back to this promise that we talked about at the beginning in Exodus. And he tries to bring them, he says, listen, do you honestly think that God would bring us this far and leave us here? Do you honestly think that God would bring us out of slavery through all these other stuff to bring us next to the land flowing with milk and honey? That's not the promise. The promise is to bring us to the land, into the land, flowing with milk and honey. And listen, if God was faithful to bring us out of slavery, if he was faithful to bring us here, don't you think God's going to be faithful to bring us all the way through? God didn't bring us this far to leave us here and dump us here. God's not done with us. God is going to fight with us. He's going to fight for us. And you need to understand that God has been faithful with everything that He said. And everything that He said is true. And so He brought us to this land. And this land is good. It's extremely good. It's exactly like He said it would be. And God has been faithful through every promise He's ever made. And why would He stop now? You see, it's a difficult situation. There's giants in this land. There are people everywhere in this land. There is tough situation in this land. And so the honest question is, why would we let a situation like a giant scare us from a God who's brought us this far? God has been faithful to every promise He's ever made through His Word, through these people, and to you and me. And guess what? He's never going to bring you to a point and leave you there. If He promised it to you, He's going to see it through. The land is exactly like God had said it would be. God has been faithful and true. And even when the circumstances look bad, God's gotten them through every time. When their backs were against the Red Sea and the Egyptians were coming after them, what did God do? He made a way when nobody else said there was a way. When they were in the desert and they were running out of food, what did He do? He provides food for them. When they get in the desert and there is no water for them, what does He do? He makes it come out of a rock. He's never left them. Why would He leave them now? Let me tell you this, church. He's never left you. Why would He leave us now? Don't think He brought you to the door of the promised land and He's going to drop you off there. Caleb says He's going to do it. We have no choice. We must do this. And Caleb understands this because he sees the faithfulness of God through over and over and over again. And he realizes that we can trust God above and beyond the circumstances that we see in front of us. Do you remember the report that the 10 spies gave about the people in the land? The people are strong. They are stronger than us, back in verse 28. The people are giants in verse 32. They are huge. We're like grasshoppers compared to them. And back in verse 28, they have large cities, which means they have lots of people in them. You don't build a large city for 2 or 3 people. A large city is for large people, a large number of people. And they're fortified. They've got these big cities with lots of people, and they've got these huge, probably walls and guards on these walls. And given the circumstances, this looks impossible. But I want you to see what Caleb says in his dissenting opinion when he's willing to stand by himself. In verse 9 of chapter 14, he says, "Don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them." Isn't that interesting? They said they would be devoured by the land, and Caleb says, no. If there's any devouring that's going to happen, we're going to devour this. And then I want you to see this, a very particular thing, as we continue reading. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. I want you to be understand that Caleb is not blind to their size. He saw the giants. He's not blind to their cities. He's not blind to how big their cities are, how fortified their cities are. You know the difference between Caleb and the other 10 is not what he saw, it's in who he's trusting. You see, for Caleb, he knows their cities are big. He knows the people are big. He knows they're well fortified. But what he knows is that God is bigger than all of that put together. You see, it's very interesting when he says their protection has been removed. It doesn't mean the walls fell down. It doesn't mean the big people are dead. It doesn't mean their strength failed. You know what that means? It means that their strength and their protection doesn't come from those things. It means the same for us, that our strength and our protection doesn't come from ourselves. It doesn't come from our physical strength. Our protection doesn't come from our vast numbers, gathered here, gathered around the world. It doesn't come from that. It means that our strength, our protection, doesn't come from how well we can organize and how well we can defend ourselves and the best strategic ideas that we can come with. It doesn't come from that. It simply means our protection comes from one place and one place only. It's got to come from God. And if God is not with us, then we are in trouble. If God is not with us and for us, then the largest, strongest army in the world cannot protect us. If God is not on our side, then the best military strategies in the world cannot make us safe. I don't care how big your missile is or how big your bunker is. If God is not with you and protecting you, it doesn't make a difference. You see, the reason that we can trust God over the circumstances is because He's made us safe. That He has a bigger protection than anything that we can imagine. He's better than any defense we can mount. He's bigger than any weapon that can be formed against us. And He's bigger than any pandemic we will ever face in all of human history. God is bigger. And it doesn't matter what the protections that other people have. It doesn't matter what the enemy brings against us. God is bigger than it. And so to be honest with you, I want you to see, I don't know what your giants are this morning. I don't know what you're facing and what bad your situation is. I don't know what armies are surrounding you right now. But I want you to know this, that the God above you is bigger than anything that's around you. That the God above you is bigger and stronger than anything you will ever face. And your protection is not in your strength, it's in His. And when your protection is in His strength, you can face it with confidence. You don't have to fear them because you know your God is bigger than them. And the last thing I want to point out about this text is that it is when you're willing to stand alone, it's going to be glorified by God. And in turn, it's going to glorify Him. You see, the last verse that we read in verse 10 sounds like a terrible verse. In verse 10, it says, while the whole community threatened to stone them, Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua, the only ones that are willing to stand up, they're getting ready to be stoned. I want you to notice the glory of the Lord appeared to all of Israel in the tent of meeting. Caleb and these men are standing alone for God, and the people are ready to kill them for it. But all of a sudden, God shows up in a way that is undeniable. God shows up in a way that only He can. In fact, if you read on down to verse 24, we find out that Caleb gets a special promise that nobody else gets, that he and Joshua are the only two in that whole generation. Everybody that's older than 20, they are the only two that are going to go into the promised land because Caleb has a different type of spirit, is what it says in verse 24. There's this great reward, and it brings about the glory of God in a way that nobody else could. You see, when you're willing to stand alone, God's going to show up, and He's going to do something amazing even when you don't expect it. Let me finish with one quick story. Wednesday, September 25th, 2019, was the National See at the Pole Day. And many of you may be familiar with that event. It invites students from around the country and really around the world to gather around the flagpole at their school before school starts and pray before school starts. And so if on that day, the National Day of Prayer or the See at the Pole Day, it's the fourth Wednesday of September every year. And so if you ride by a school early that morning, it's not unusual to see 10, 20, sometimes 50 or more kids, depending on how big the school is, out front around their flagpole. And it's an amazing thing to watch. But on September the 25th, 2019, if you'd have ridden by Lake Manola High School that morning, I want to show you what you'd seen. This. It's a school of over 1,860 kids, and only one of them showed up at the flagpole that morning. A young man by the name of Hayden. And a mom, not Hayden's mom, but another mom, who was dropping her son off, took this picture of him and posted it on Facebook. And people throughout the community and other parts of the country, they started to see this and share this post and comment on it. And Hayden's mom didn't even know that this is happening. She didn't even know that these posts were going on about her son until hours after it had happened. And then later she sent her son a text while he was still in school. And her text simply said this: you should know that the people in our community are going crazy about a young man who stood at a flagpole alone and prayed this morning. They're talking about what an amazing young man he must be and how proud his parents should be. And I want you to know that your parents are so proud of you. You're an amazing young man, and I love you so much. His mom went on to say that when he got home, he and her sat down and they started reading through the comments together, and he broke out in tears as they read those comments. She said, "Honey, what's wrong?" Hayden simply said, "When I first got there, I thought I would just pray till somebody else showed up. And eventually I realized that nobody else was coming. So I started to ask God to do something with my standing alone. And I prayed that God, as these people drive by, let them wonder. Let their hearts be pricked." Later, his mom wrote that whatever impossible situation you are facing right now, my son would like to remind you of one thing: that God can do big things when you're standing alone for Him. Let's pray together.